It was September 1st, 1941, and a group of British Spitfire Mk5s flew a routine mission over France when they were attacked by 4 never-before-seen fighters with German markings. They surprised the group with such speed, shooting down 4 Spitfires without a single loss on the German side. The surviving British pilots didn't know it at the time, but they had just seen the new German fighter for the first time, which was about to become their biggest fear in the skies. The British Royal Air Force was, for the entire year, fighting a heavy war with the German Luftwaffe. The Messerschmitt Bf 109 had been their biggest enemy up until that moment, and although it initially caught off guard the Hawker Hurricanes and early marks of the Spitfire, it was now being put under control with the supply of enough Spitfire Mk5s. The Royal Air Force was finally catching a breath and had begun pushing the Luftwaffe back into France. However, just as the situation finally seemed to begin favoring the Allies, out of nowhere emerged a new German fighter that simply outmatched everything they had. Its performance was unseen up until then. Spitfire losses quickly began mounting, and anyone trying to engage this new fighter wouldn't return. To make matters even worse, Allied intelligence had no idea it even existed. Its early sightings were written off, thinking it was some kind of modified, captured French plane. The Allies panicked. But it was only going to get worse from here, as this new German fighter would appear in increasing numbers until something completely unexpected happened that would give the Allies all the answers they needed to realize what this was and how to counter it. What we're talking about here is, of course, the subject of our video, the Focke-Wulf 190. Before going into combat, it would be interesting to set the stage first and explain why this fighter was developed in a completely different way than its older, famous brother, the Bf 109. The 190 would start as an idea in 1937, when the Germans wanted something to fight alongside their 109s, and one of those ideas would catch their attention. It was Kurt Tank's concept of creating a fighter with a radial engine, which was rare at a time when the focus was on making fighters as small and slick as possible. The radial engine was considered too big for a nimble fighter, but Kurt wanted to use an engine so powerful that it would compensate for the additional drag it created with its size. This way, it would be even faster, but also able to carry heavier weapons while being much harder to kill. Water-cooled engines could be taken out with just a single machine gun bullet hitting the waterline, after which the engine would quickly overheat. For this radial, air-cooled beast of an engine, that wasn't the case. There were pilots flying back to base with several cylinders shattered by fire. We're talking about the BMW 801, a 14-cylinder, 41.8-litre beast of an engine, putting out around 1,800 horsepower and giving at the time unmatched speed. The whole FW190 was specifically designed for harsh wartime conditions, and that meant being easy to maintain in the field, able to land on hastily prepared runways, much less challenging to fly so the pilots could be trained faster, and of course, able to take massive damage and survive to fly back, be repaired, and fight another day. So the 190 was developed, went into production, and soon the first units arrived at the front lines for combat testing. It was received with doubt at first, and some German pilots preferred the proven Bf 109s. They would quickly change their minds when they went into combat, however. In the new fighter, German top aces would score hundreds of air kills, like Josef Priller, for example, who shot down at least 68 Spitfires out of his 101 confirmed wins. Sadly for the Spitfire pilots, they would also immediately notice the difference between the 109 and this new thing the Germans came up with. And when we say notice the difference, we mean the Spitfire was about to get outclassed. The Bf 109 and Spitfire Mark I were basically on par in terms of performance, with the result of a fight mostly depending on the starting position and the skill of the pilots. But the Spitfire Mark V would introduce 2 20mm cannons in its wings, among other improvements, which gave it the upper hand against the 109s. The 190s, however, were quick to ruin the RAF's naive expectations that they now had a better fighter. The Focke-Wulf could easily outclimb and outdive the Spitfire Mark V, and its roll rate was unheard of at the time. RAF pilots quickly learned they couldn't turn with it, couldn't chase it in a dive, and that its firepower was much more effective. Typical standard armament of the Focke-Wulf included 2 MG-17 machine guns mounted above the engine and 2 20mm cannons in the wing roots. This doesn't sound like much, but the catch was that they were all firing through the propeller arc using an interrupter mechanism, while later models even had 2 additional 20mm mounted in the outer wing positions. Something usually overlooked is this placement of their guns. The Spitfire Mark V, for example, carried 2 20mm Hispano cannons and 4 .303 caliber machine guns, all mounted out in the wings. That meant they weren't firing through the propeller and were spaced more widely apart. The guns were carefully aligned to converge at a specific distance, usually around 250 to 300 yards. But outside that narrow sweet spot, the rounds would start to spread out. Now, when you take a look at the Focke-Wulf's armament being concentrated more toward the center of the aircraft and firing through the propeller arc, that meant most of its firepower was going right down the center line in a tighter grouping and more effective at longer range, giving it a much deadlier punch. The Focke-Wulf had every aspect in mind for dogfighting. It had a bubble canopy, improving visibility drastically compared to the 109. Controls were well organized and easier to use in the chaos of combat. The engine was tuned to perform best at low to mid altitudes, because that's where most dogfights take place. High altitude performance wasn't great, but it was never thought to be important for a dogfighter, although this issue would cost them dearly later, but we'll come to that. One unique feature in the 190 was an automatic engine management system, which relieved the pilot of having to manually adjust the fuel mixture depending on the altitude like in previous fighters. He could just focus on flying and fighting. Now it was June of 1942 and the Allies had only heard about the Focke-Wulf through some reports, but they still didn't have a single piece of solid information. Then something outright bizarre happened. A young German pilot, Armin Faber, had just gotten out of a dogfight with a Spitfire in his 190, which he won. When he turned around, he realized there was no one around from his group. He had gotten disoriented during the dives and turns and was now flying in the completely opposite direction from where he thought he was going. Thinking he was over France, he was actually over England. He was flying deep inland when he soon saw a training airfield, which he mistook for a German airfield in France. Luckily for him, the airfield didn't have anti-aircraft guns, and he casually landed his Focke-Wulf while the ground crew, completely in disbelief, guided him to the hangar. Then, as he took a better look around, he could see a soldier on his wing with a pistol pointed at him. He realized what a horrible mistake he had made, and that he had just landed an intact, secretive new fighter right onto an enemy airfield. To make matters worse for him, 190 pilots were at first specifically ordered not to fly across the English Channel, exactly because of the risk of capture. Armin had just given his enemies everything they needed to know on how to defeat the Focke-Wulf. And they needed that information desperately, because the Focke-Wulf would soon begin appearing in raids over England, and also on the Eastern Front and in North Africa, where they had enormous success against all Allied fighters. The data the Allies got from thoroughly testing the captured Focke-Wulf directly influenced the accelerated development and deployment of the Spitfire Mk, but also the Hawker Tempest and the Hawker Sea Fury. Powered by the new two-stage supercharged Merlin 61 engine, the Mk finally gave RAF pilots a fighting chance. It could now match the FW-190 in speed and climb, and it performed much better at higher altitudes. Rather than going into turning contests with the Focke-Wulf, RAF pilots started using energy fighting, high-speed slashing attacks, and greater coordination between squadrons. Still, the 190 remained a serious threat. In skilled hands, it could dive away and escape, or use its superior roll rate to outmaneuver even a Mk9. As 1943 was approaching and the Allied bombing campaign intensified, the 190s would get a new job, and one for which they were never designed. Although they initially had great success in causing tremendous bomber losses to the Allies, everything would soon change for the worse for the 190s. At first, bombers flew without fighter escorts, and the main concern for German interceptors was the bombers' machine guns. Like the famous B-17 Flying Fortress, which had up to 1350 caliber machine guns in turrets and flew in tight box formations, it still wasn't enough to protect them from fighters. The 190s were up-armed with heavier 30mm cannons and even unguided rockets for downing huge bomber formations. But very soon, this would work completely against them, as the Allies introduced long-range fighter escort, finally solving the problem of the fighters' short range. Among the P-47 Thunderbolts and improved Spitfires were now also the new and lethal American P-51 Mustangs. The Focke-Wulf, which never had great performance at high altitudes to begin with, was now burdened with heavier weapons meant for fighting bombers. It was easily outturned and decimated by Allied fighters, which favored higher altitudes. To make matters worse, most of the aces and experienced German pilots were long dead, and their hastily trained young replacements were decimated over the skies of their homeland as they desperately tried to defend it from bombing raids. The Germans tried to solve this problem with the D model, with a newer engine tuned for high altitude, and it was actually on par with the American Mustang. They would prove quite effective and would down a lot of bombers, but they were still strangled by the deteriorating situation in the German army, with constant shortages in everything. The final and most advanced version, the Focke-Wulf TA-152, would enter service with some 70 units, but it would arrive simply too little, too late. The war was already lost. If you enjoy videos like this, feel free to check out our channel for more.